Welcome to Asian Ghost Archive, where we dedicate ourselves to sharing Asian supernatural tales. The first story comes from a netizen named Lee Sin. This incident happened when he was in his teens. His family lived in a remote mountain area of Yunnan. In their locality, people in the mountains still held some traditional gender biases. While most individuals might not place great importance on having a boy or girl, this mindset often comes from older generations passing down their beliefs. Moreover, if someone living in the village couldn't have a son, they were frequently blamed for being an ineffective man. Li Xin's small mountain village was no exception. The young couples who worked away from home would return to their families every year if they had sons. Otherwise, they might only come back after several years. The children at home were mostly taken care of by their grandparents, their fathers and mothers' parents. Li Xin grew up in much the same way, under his grandfather and grandmother's guidance. At that time, he was living with his grandparents. There lived another family nearby, a household known for its extreme preference for boys. They longed for a son so desperately it seemed they were losing their minds over him. This man, named Jian Cheng, married a woman who gave birth to a daughter after their union. The couple had hoped to have more children, but ever since the daughter was born, the wife never became pregnant again. As time passed, the daughter grew older and reached an age where marriage talks were appropriate. Yet, there was no sign of another pregnancy in Jian Cheng's wife. This made Jian Cheng feel deeply ashamed. He believed that villagers would mock him for not being able to produce a son. Sometimes, he even scolded his wife, calling her a useless hen who couldn't lay an egg. Although the couple desperately desired a boy, by this point they were already too old to have another child. Their daughter was nearly 9 years old and could go on blind dates. Their wife had difficulty conceiving at all now. For many years, Jian Cheng and his wife searched for any remedy or folk cure that might help them conceive a son. They visited temples frequently, praying earnestly to the gods for a good son. They also went to their parents' graves every few days, burning incense sticks in hopes of ancestral blessings. They promised whatever it took if they could have just one boy. One day, according to villagers, Jian Cheng seemed like he had encountered some kind of deity or supernatural being. This story was spread by Jian Cheng himself during a time when he and his wife were helping relatives with farm work. The night became unusually dark and difficult to navigate. Normally, they would stay overnight, but something compelled them that evening to return home immediately. On their way back, they noticed an unfamiliar temple appearing before them, a structure that wasn't there in the afternoon. The gate was small but newly built, and from outside it sounded incredibly lively inside. Curious, they stopped at the entrance and peeked into the temple. As they watched, a man dressed in blue robes emerged. The man immediately called out Jian Cheng's name. Before Jian Cheng could figure out who this person was, he said that an immortal had instructed him to enter the temple and bring them a son. Overwhelmed with excitement at the mention of immortal and son, Jian Cheng didn't hesitate long before dragging his wife inside. Once inside, they discovered another world entirely, a grand courtyard surrounded by what seemed like countless identical figures dressed in blue robes. In front stood an ornate hall containing a statue approximately 2 to 3 stories tall made of gold and jade. The man leading them explained that this was the Hall of Blessings where immortals resided. As Jian Cheng approached, he noticed everyone looked almost exactly alike except for subtle differences in facial expressions. When he reached the figure standing before the statue, he didn't know how to begin speaking. But just then, someone emerged from behind and asked him directly. His wish was truly sincere about wanting a son above all else. Hearing this question, Jian Cheng knelt down immediately without hesitation or ceremony, just as one would do in traditional Chinese storytelling when making an oath before deities. He answered yes repeatedly until the figure standing before him declared that their words were enough and instructed them to return home for news. Excited beyond measure by this divine response, Jian Cheng and his wife bowed deeply on the ground, both thanking and supplicating themselves simultaneously. Then they left with their heads lowered in reverence. Upon exiting the temple grounds, however, it vanished completely, like a mirage that evaporated instantly upon waking from its dream state. Shocked speechless by this impossible event, Jian Cheng returned home convinced he had encountered real immortals. The following day, Jian Cheng told everyone he met about his encounter with immortals inside the mysterious temple. He claimed that an immortal had promised to grant him a son as a reward for their faith and prayers. This meant that from now on, he would be recognized in the village not just as someone who had children, but specifically as one who possessed a legitimate male heir, ensuring his status among fellow villagers. Many dismissed these claims as delusional boasting at first. However, after about half a year passed without incident, Jane Cheng's wife unexpectedly became pregnant again. Overjoyed by this natural conception despite their desperate wish for another son through supernatural means, Jane Cheng shared the news more enthusiastically than ever before, embellishing details with each retelling. True to his expectations, 10 months later she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Celebrations erupted throughout the village upon hearing about the newborn son's arrival. But just days after this joyous occasion, tragedy struck unexpectedly during their festivities celebrating the new life. On that very day, when they were preparing for the traditional naming ceremony and celebration banquet for the infant son, Jane Cheng's daughter suddenly woke up from sleep with her head inexplicably stuck in a downward position. She found herself unable to lift her head normally upon waking, as if something heavy was pressing down on it. When asked what felt uncomfortable by her parents and grandparents present at the scene, she described feeling pressure specifically between her neck and the back of her skull, preventing any natural movement or lifting sensation regardless of how hard she tried. This strange condition manifested suddenly despite previously being healthy. Jane Cheng panicked immediately upon hearing this news about his daughter affliction while simultaneously celebrating his son's birth. He rushed to take his daughter to see doctors in nearby county hospitals and eventually major provincial medical centers, hoping for a cure through modern medicine. However, the substantial costs associated with specialized treatment posed significant financial strain on their long, isolated mountain household. Compounding this challenge was another newborn son requiring care and attention, creating double burden due to strong son preference prevalent locally. These combined circumstances forced them into difficult decisions regarding both children's futures shortly after welcoming Jane Cheng's new son home from the hospital. From that day forward, persistent whispers began circulating among villagers about supernatural explanations for their situation. Some claimed Jane Cheng had made a pact with local mountain spirits or demons to obtain his son through forbidden exchange at great cost, essentially trading one child's health for another. Others suggested perhaps this second son wasn't naturally conceived either. Jane Cheng, who was around 40 at that time, was known for her strength and capability. During this period, an elderly villager died, so Jane Cheng got up early in the morning to assist with preparations. She worked late into the night, helping until everything was done. After finishing at their neighbor's house, he returned home exhausted but still normal. That evening, after eating something good for his and his son, they went to sleep as usual. But the next day, before dawn, Jane Cheng's wife heard a series of loud thuds coming from the yard. Sounds like something heavy had been dropped or smashed against the ground or walls. At first, she thought it was just Jane Cheng accidentally knocking over something while carrying their son around. But his son kept crying loudly, and the sounds in the yard continued without stopping. So he got up, dressed herself, picked up her baby boy, and walked outside to see what was going on, comforting him as he cried. When they reached the yard, Jane Cheng's wife was shocked by her husband's state. His eyes were wide open but lifeless, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. He was holding a curved knife, a typical chopping blade used for vegetables. Then, without warning, their son started crying again, and Jane Cheng reacted violently. He snatched the baby from her wife's arms and threw him to the ground before turning into a raging maniac, chasing after his mother and attacking her relentlessly with the knife. The scene was chaotic. Jane Cheng was stabbing at her wife as if possessed. But luckily, it was still dark outside when this happened. Jane Cheng's wife managed to escape through the darkness by crawling towards their nearest neighbor's house. Once inside, the neighbors immediately called 120 and alerted the police. They also gathered other villagers nearby with their farming tools, axes, hoes, whatever they had, to confront Jane Cheng. When they entered her yard after closing off the gate, everyone was horrified to see blood splattered everywhere. The courtyard was stained red from head to toe, and it continued into the house itself. Inside, near the front door, lay Jane Cheng's son, just under a year old, without his head. His body had been brutally dismembered. One leg appeared to have been broken at the knee, while the other seemed snapped entirely off mid. Both arms were similarly fractured and bent backward unnaturally. The scene was so gruesome that everyone present could only imagine how much pain their son must have endured before he died. They saw him lying there with multiple stab wounds across his body, some deep enough to sever muscle, others shallow but still terrifying in context, and the knife marks on his neck were uneven and jagged, suggesting a prolonged struggle. Then they noticed something else. Jean Cheng was holding her son's head while sitting on their bed. He kept repeating phrases in their local dialect as if comforting him. "Good son, daddy will put you to sleep." The expression on her face was beyond disturbing. It sent chills down everyone's spines and made them question whether they were witnessing something supernatural. No one dared to intervene directly. They cautiously retrieved the knife from her hand before closing off all exits until help arrived. Once police and emergency responders arrived, they took over, handling Jane Cheng's case professionally while trying to understand what happened at his home that night. Jane Cheng's wife survived because the knife wasn't sharp enough to cause a fatal injury, but she was deeply traumatized by witnessing her husband's breakdown firsthand. Later reports indicated that she eventually recovered from shock and moved away with her daughter, but neither of them ever spoke about why they left or what happened afterward. As for Jane Cheng himself, village rumors suggested he never fully recovered after losing his child. Some say he was executed, others that he received a life sentence. Either way, it didn't end well for him. This is Heejin Ghost Archive. Thanks for listening. If you like our analysis, please be sure to subscribe, and we look forward to sharing your stories.